Picture this. It is July 1914, and a 31-year-old man stands before a crowd of thousands in Milan, his fist raised in the air, his voice hoarse from shouting. He is speaking about the evils of nationalism, the poison of militarism, and the necessity of international working-class solidarity. He declares that workers have no country, that the coming war is nothing but a capitalist conspiracy to enrich the wealthy while spilling the blood of the poor. The crowd roars its approval. This man is the editor of Italy's most influential socialist newspaper. He is considered one of the most promising revolutionary leaders in Europe. His name is Benito Mussolini, and in this moment, he is the socialist movement's golden boy. Now flash forward just 4 months, November 1914. The same man stands before a different crowd, and his message has transformed beyond recognition. He now advocates passionately for Italian entry into World War I. He calls for national glory, military strength, and the forging of a new Italian identity through violence and struggle. His former comrades are stunned. Within weeks, the Socialist Party that nurtured his career will expel him as a traitor. Within a decade, he will create fascism, an ideology that represents the complete inversion of everything he once claimed to believe. Within 2 decades, he will be the absolute dictator of Italy, allied with Adolf Hitler, leading his nation toward catastrophic destruction. This is not a story of gradual evolution. This is not a tale of slowly shifting beliefs over years of reflection. This is the story of one of the most dramatic and consequential ideological reversals in modern history, a transformation so rapid and complete that it continues to baffle historians more than a century later. What you are about to discover will challenge everything you think you understand about political ideology, personal conviction, and the malleability of human belief. The question that has haunted scholars for generations is deceptively simple. How does a man go from being a committed socialist revolutionary to becoming the founder of fascism in the span of a few short years? Was Mussolini always a fascist, hiding behind socialist rhetoric, simply waiting for the right moment to reveal his true beliefs? Was his conversion genuine, the result of profound experiences that transformed his worldview? Or was something else at work, something more cynical, more calculated, and more disturbing than either of these explanations? Stay with me, because the answer involves bribery, betrayal, psychological complexity, and historical forces colliding in ways that would reshape the entire 20th century. This is the untold story of the most shocking political transformation in modern history. Before we move into this shocking political transformation, I need to ask you something. If you are fascinated by untold stories from history, stories that reveal the hidden truths behind the events that shaped our world, then hit that subscribe button right now. This channel is dedicated to uncovering the most compelling and least known historical narratives, and subscribing ensures you never miss these deep investigations. We publish videos like this every week, but YouTube only shows them to a small fraction of viewers unless you subscribe. Click that button, turn on notifications, and let me show you how one man completely reinvented himself and changed the course of history. To understand how Mussolini could abandon socialism so completely, we must first understand how deeply embedded he was in the socialist movement and how genuine his early commitment appeared to be. Because make no mistake, the young Mussolini was not a casual socialist or a mere sympathizer. He was one of the most prominent and respected revolutionary socialists in all of Europe. Benito Mussolini. Andrea Mussolini was born on July 29, 1883, in the small town of Predoppio in the Romagna region of Italy. His very name was a declaration of his father's political convictions. His first name honored Benito Juarez, the Mexican revolutionary president. His middle names honored Italian socialist martyrs Amilcare Cipriani and Andrea Costa. From his earliest memories, Mussolini was immersed in radical politics. His father, Alessandro, was a blacksmith who spent more time reading socialist literature and organizing workers than he did running his business. The Mussolini household was perpetually on the edge of poverty, but it was rich in revolutionary fervor. Young Benito absorbed his father's ideology with an intensity that bordered on obsession, but he combined it with an intellectualism inherited from his mother, Rosa, who was a schoolteacher. This combination of working-class revolutionary passion and intellectual sophistication would define Mussolini's early career and make him such a formidable figure within the socialist movement. He was not simply repeating slogans. He was engaging with socialist theory at the highest levels, reading Marx and Engels in the original German, studying the works of Sorel and Nietzsche, and synthesizing these ideas into his own revolutionary vision. After completing his education and briefly working as a school teacher himself, Mussolini fled Italy in 1902 to avoid military service. He spent 2 years in Switzerland, living in desperate poverty but using every spare moment to educate himself and network with other socialist exiles. This period in Switzerland was crucial to his development. He attended lectures by important socialist theorists, participated in intense political debates, and began to develop his reputation as a powerful speaker and writer. The Swiss authorities eventually expelled him for his political activities, cementing his credentials as a serious revolutionary rather than a mere dilettante. Upon returning to Italy, Mussolini threw himself into socialist organizing and journalism. He possessed a natural gift for inflammatory rhetoric that could move crowds to either tears or rage. His writing style was sharp, aggressive, and uncompromising. He attacked not only capitalism and the ruling classes, but also moderate socialists whom he viewed as traitors to the revolutionary cause. He positioned himself firmly on the radical left wing of the socialist movement, advocating for violent revolution rather than gradual reform, for international working-class solidarity rather than nationalist sentiment, and for the complete overthrow of existing institutions rather than incremental change within them. His rise within the movement was meteoric. In 1912, at the age of just 29, Mussolini became the editor of Avanti, the official newspaper of the Italian Socialist Party. This was not some minor provincial publication. Avanti was the voice of Italian socialism, with a circulation of tens of thousands and influence that extended throughout the country. For Mussolini to be appointed to this position at such a young age was a testament to how highly regarded he was within the movement. Under his editorship, the newspaper's circulation more than doubled. His articles were widely read, quoted, and discussed. He became one of the most recognizable faces of Italian socialism. During this period, Mussolini's socialist credentials were impeccable. He wrote passionately against militarism and imperialism. When Italy invaded Libya in 1911, Mussolini organized protests and wrote scathing denunciations of what he called a capitalist war of conquest. He was arrested multiple times for his political activities and wore these arrests as badges of honor. He spoke at socialist congresses across Europe and was regarded as one of the rising stars of international socialism. His theoretical writings during this period show someone deeply engaged with Marxist analysis, someone who appeared to genuinely believe that the proletarian revolution was not only necessary, but inevitable. Those who knew him during these years described a man of absolute conviction. His private correspondence reveals someone who lived and breathed socialist ideology. He surrounded himself with committed revolutionaries. His romantic relationships were with women who shared his political beliefs. Every aspect of his public and private life seemed aligned with his stated socialist principles. There was no indication whatsoever that this man would, within a few short years, become the founder of an ideology explicitly designed to destroy socialism. This makes what happened next all the more shocking and historically significant, because when the transformation came, it came with a speed that suggested either the most profound conversion in modern political history or the most cynical betrayal imaginable. The catalyst for Mussolini's transformation was World War I, but not in the way you might expect. The story of how and why Mussolini reversed his position on the war remains one of the most contested and fascinating questions in modern historical scholarship. When the war broke out in August 1914, Italy was not immediately involved. The country was nominally allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary through the Triple Alliance, but the Italian government declared neutrality, arguing that the alliance was defensive in nature and that Austria-Hungary's aggression against Serbia violated its terms. This neutrality created an intense political debate within Italy about what the country should do. For the Italian Socialist Party, the position was clear and unambiguous. The war was an imperialist conflict between capitalist powers, and the working classes of all nations should refuse to participate in the mutual slaughter. The Socialists organized massive anti-war demonstrations and used every platform available to them to denounce militarism and nationalism. As editor of Avanti, Mussolini was at the forefront of this campaign. His articles during the early months of the war were filled with passionate denunciations of the conflict and calls for international working-class solidarity. Then suddenly and without warning, everything changed. In mid-October 1914, Mussolini published an article in Avanti titled "From Absolute Neutrality to Active and Operative Neutrality." The article suggested that Italian socialists should reconsider their position and possibly support Italian intervention in the war on the side of the Allies against Austria-Hungary and Germany. The reaction within the socialist movement was immediate and explosive. Comrades who had worked alongside Mussolini for years were stunned. Emergency meetings were called. Accusations of betrayal flew back and forth. On October 20, 1914, just days after his article appeared, Mussolini was forced to resign as editor of Avanti. On November 24, 1914, the Socialist Party formally expelled him. The man who had been their most prominent spokesman, their rising star, their revolutionary firebrand, was now denounced as a traitor to the working class. The expulsion proceedings were bitter and personal, with former comrades accusing Mussolini of selling out the movement for personal gain. They were more right than they knew, because what the socialists did not know at the time, and what would only be revealed decades later through historical research, was that Mussolini's sudden conversion to interventionism was not purely ideological. He was being paid. The question is by whom and for what purpose. The evidence that has emerged over the years points to a complex web of financial support flowing to Mussolini from multiple sources, all interested in pushing Italy into the war on the Allied side. French intelligence services, through intermediaries, provided substantial funding. French industrialists, who stood to benefit from Italian participation, contributed money. Even some Italian business interests, recognizing the economic opportunities that war would create, channeled funds to Mussolini. The amounts involved were significant, enough to allow Mussolini to immediately launch his own newspaper, Il Popolo d'Italia, which became a major platform for pro-war propaganda. Documents discovered in French archives in the 1960s confirm that Mussolini received regular payments from French sources starting in late 1914 and continuing through 1917. The French government, desperate to open a new front against Austria-Hungary, was willing to invest heavily in Italian interventionist propaganda. Mussolini, whatever his ideological motivations may have been, was certainly aware that his new political position came with substantial financial rewards that his previous socialist principles had never provided. But here is where the story becomes more complex and psychologically interesting, because while the financial incentives were real and significant, many historians who have studied Mussolini's writings and behavior during this period believe that something more than mere bribery was at work. There is evidence that Mussolini was experiencing a genuine ideological crisis, that his views were actually shifting in response to the war and its implications, and that the money simply made it easier for him to act on beliefs that were already changing. In the months following his expulsion from the Socialist Party, Mussolini wrote extensively about why he had changed his position. He argued that the war represented an opportunity for revolutionary change that transcended the old categories of socialist thought. He claimed that national identity and the experience of shared struggle could create the kind of mass mobilization necessary for fundamental social transformation. He suggested that the socialist movement had become too rigid, too attached to outdated theoretical frameworks, and unable to respond to the dynamic realities of modern history. These arguments, while self-serving, also showed someone attempting to work through a genuine intellectual and political transformation. The question of whether Mussolini's conversion was genuine or cynical may be the wrong question. Human motivations are rarely pure, and it is entirely possible that Mussolini experienced both a real shift in his beliefs and an attraction to the financial and political opportunities that this shift created. What matters historically is not whether his conversion was sincere, but what it revealed about the malleability of political ideology and the ease with which even seemingly committed revolutionaries can abandon their principles under the right circumstances. Mussolini's embrace of interventionism was just the first step in his transformation. Once he had broken with socialism and embraced nationalism, a whole new political trajectory opened before him. He served in the Italian army from 1915 to 1917, when he was wounded by an exploding mortar shell during a training exercise. His war service, though brief, gave him credentials as a combat veteran and allowed him to speak with authority about the soldier's experience. When he returned to civilian life and resumed his work with Il Popolo d'Italia, he had fully transitioned from socialist revolutionary to nationalist agitator. But he had not yet invented fascism. That would come next, emerging from the specific conditions of post-war Italy and Mussolini's ability to synthesize elements from across the political spectrum into something entirely new and terrifyingly effective. The Italy that emerged from World War I was a nation in crisis, and it was in this crisis that Mussolini found the opportunity to create his new political movement. To understand how fascism was born, we need to understand the specific conditions that made it possible and how Mussolini positioned himself to exploit them. Italy had technically won the war, fighting on the Allied side and ending up on the victorious coalition. But the victory felt hollow to many Italians. The war had cost hundreds of thousands of Italian lives, devastated the economy, and left the country deeply in debt. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, Italy's territorial demands were largely ignored by the other Allied powers. Nationalists spoke bitterly of a mutilated victory, arguing that Italy had sacrificed enormously but received almost nothing in return. This sense of betrayal and humiliation created fertile ground for extremist movements. At the same time, Italy was experiencing severe economic dislocation and social upheaval. Inflation was rampant. Unemployment was high, especially among demobilized soldiers who returned home to find no jobs available. Industrial workers, inspired by the Russian Revolution of 1917, engaged in strikes and factory occupations. In some areas, particularly in the industrial north, workers established Soviet-style councils and appeared to be on the verge of attempting revolution. The middle classes and property owners watched these developments with growing alarm, fearing that Italy was about to follow Russia into communist revolution. Into this volatile situation stepped Mussolini with a political innovation that would change history. On March 23, 1919, in a meeting hall in Milan, he founded the Fasci Italiani di Combattimento, the Italian combat squads. This was the birth of the fascist movement, though it would be several years before the ideology and organizational structure fully developed. What Mussolini created was something genuinely new in European politics, a synthesis that drew elements from multiple sources while remaining distinct from any of them. From his socialist past, Mussolini took the emphasis on mass mobilization, the use of revolutionary rhetoric, and the understanding of how to organize and energize working-class supporters. From nationalism, he took the emphasis on national unity, military virtue, and the glorification of the state. From syndicalism, a radical labor movement theory he had engaged with during his socialist years, he took ideas about organizing society by economic function rather than democratic representation. From futurism, an Italian artistic movement that glorified technology, speed, and violence, he took aesthetic sensibilities and rhetorical styles. And from his own experience in psychological makeup, he added the cult of the leader, the emphasis on will and action over theory and deliberation, and the celebration of violence as a cleansing and regenerative force. The result was an ideology that was deliberately incoherent in its details, but devastatingly effective in its emotional appeal. Fascism rejected both capitalism and socialism while claiming to transcend them. It promised national renewal through authoritarian leadership. It offered a vision of society organized not around class conflict, but around national unity and shared purpose. It provided an outlet for the violence and rage that many returning soldiers felt. And crucially, it positioned itself as the only force capable of stopping communist revolution. The early fascist movement was small and marginal. In the 1919 elections, fascist candidates were humiliated, receiving almost no votes. But Mussolini understood that electoral politics was only one path to power. He focused instead on building a paramilitary organization that could use violence to achieve political objectives. The fascist squads, initially made up largely of war veterans, began attacking socialist organizations, beating up labor leaders, destroying socialist newspaper offices, and breaking strikes through intimidation and violence. What made fascism distinctive was that this violence was not covert or shameful. It was celebrated as a virtue, as evidence of the movement's vitality and strength. Fascist squads wore black shirts as a uniform, adopted Roman salutes, and engaged in ritualized displays of aggression. They sang patriotic songs as they beat their opponents. They claimed to be saving Italy from chaos and revolution through direct action that the weak liberal state was unable or unwilling to take. This strategy proved devastatingly effective. As fascist violence escalated throughout 1920 and 1921, Italy's conservative elites, traditional right-wing parties, and even some liberals began to see Mussolini as a useful force against the socialist threat. Property owners and industrialists provided funding to fascist squads. Local police and military authorities often looked the other way, or even quietly assisted when fascists attacked socialist organizations. Politicians who had initially dismissed Mussolini as a dangerous demagogue began to see him as someone they could work with, someone who could restore order and protect property rights. Mussolini brilliantly exploited this dynamic. He positioned fascism as radical enough to appeal to the disaffected masses, particularly veterans who felt betrayed by both the old political establishment and the socialist movement. But he also presented it as sufficiently conservative to reassure elites that their fundamental interests would be protected. He claimed to be revolutionary and counter-revolutionary simultaneously, destroying the old corrupt system while preserving social hierarchy and property relations. This ideological flexibility, which critics called incoherence, was actually one of fascism's greatest strengths. It could mean different things to different constituencies while maintaining the appearance of unified purpose. By 1921, fascism had become a major political force. Mussolini was elected to parliament, and fascist squads effectively controlled large areas of northern and central Italy through intimidation and violence. The liberal Italian state appeared powerless to stop them, partly because it lacked the will to do so, and partly because significant elements within the establishment actively supported the fascist campaign against the left. The contrast with Mussolini's socialist past was now complete and unmistakable. The man who had once called for international working-class solidarity now led a movement that specialized in beating and sometimes murdering socialist workers. The man who had denounced militarism and nationalism now glorified both. The man who had advocated for revolutionary overthrow of the capitalist state now received funding from industrialists and worked within the parliamentary system while simultaneously undermining it through organized violence. Every principle he had once claimed to hold had been inverted or abandoned. What does this transformation tell us about ideology and political belief? Some historians argue that Mussolini was always fundamentally an authoritarian personality who simply switched the content of his beliefs while maintaining a consistent style of absolutism and intolerance. Others suggest that his socialist phase was always more about personal ambition than genuine conviction, and that he abandoned socialism as soon as a more promising path to power appeared. Still others point to the specific historical circumstances of post-war Italy and argue that Mussolini's transformation was enabled by the breakdown of normal political categories in a moment of crisis. All of these interpretations capture partial truths, but what is undeniable is that by 1922, Mussolini had positioned himself as the most dynamic and dangerous political figure in Italy, and he was preparing for the move that would bring him to absolute power. The event that brought Mussolini to power has become legendary, the March on Rome in October 1922. But like much of the fascist mythology, the reality was considerably different from the heroic narrative that Mussolini would later promote. The story of how Mussolini actually became prime minister reveals much about the weakness of Italian democracy and the complicity of established institutions in fascism's rise. By the summer of 1922, Italy was experiencing a profound political crisis. The liberal democratic system that had governed Italy since unification appeared to be collapsing. Governments changed with bewildering frequency, unable to command stable majorities in parliament. Fascist violence continued to escalate, with fascist squads now controlling entire regions. Socialist and communist organizations had been effectively destroyed in many areas through systematic intimidation and violence. The state's monopoly on legitimate force had been shattered, and significant portions of Italian territory were effectively under fascist control rather than government authority. Mussolini recognized that this was his moment. He began making increasingly aggressive demands for fascist participation in government, while his squads intensified their activities to demonstrate that he had the power to back up these demands. The implicit threat was clear: either bring fascism into government on favorable terms or face continued chaos and possible civil war. In October 1922, Mussolini planned what he called the March on Rome. Fascist squads throughout Italy would converge on the capital, creating an overwhelming show of force that would compel the government to capitulate to fascist demands. The plan had serious risks. The Italian army was far more powerful than the fascist squads, and if the government ordered a military response, the march could be easily crushed. Everything depended on the government's will to resist and on King Victor Emmanuel III's willingness to declare martial law and use force to maintain constitutional order. On October 27, 1922, columns of black-shirted fascists began moving toward Rome. The sitting prime minister, Luigi Facta, recognized the threat and prepared a decree of martial law that would authorize military action to stop the march. He presented this decree to King Victor Emmanuel III for his signature, which was required to make it effective. The next few hours would determine the fate of Italian democracy. King Victor Emmanuel III refused to sign the decree. His reasons for this decision have been debated by historians ever since. Some argue that he was simply a weak and indecisive personality who feared conflict. Others suggest that he had been influenced by conservative advisors who had convinced him that Mussolini could be controlled and that bringing fascism into government would stabilize Italy. Still others point to reports that reached the king suggesting that elements of the military might not remain loyal if ordered to fire on the fascist squads, creating the possibility that resistance could trigger a civil war. Whatever the king's reasoning, his refusal to sign the martial law decree was the death warrant for Italian democracy. Prime Minister Facta resigned, and the king invited Mussolini to Rome to form a new government. On October 30, 1922, Mussolini traveled to Rome by train, wearing a black shirt to emphasize his fascist credentials. He was appointed prime minister at the age of 39. The fascist squads did eventually enter Rome, but only after Mussolini had already been appointed. The March on Rome was thus more political theater than genuine military operation, a demonstration of force rather than an actual seizure of power. Mussolini would later cultivate the myth of the march as a revolutionary conquest, but the reality was that he came to power through constitutional means. Invited by the king and initially leading a coalition government that included traditional conservatives and liberals alongside fascists. But while Mussolini's initial appointment was constitutional, what he did with power was anything but. Almost immediately, he began the process of consolidating control and transforming Italy into a fascist dictatorship. He used the threat of fascist violence to intimidate Parliament into granting him extraordinary powers. He placed fascists in key positions throughout the government and bureaucracy. He used state power to further destroy opposition parties and organizations. And he made clear that the constitutional window dressing of coalition government was temporary, that his ultimate goal was complete fascist control. The question that haunts this period is why Italy's democratic institutions offered so little resistance. How could a man who had been expelled from the Socialist Party less than 8 years earlier, who led a movement that openly glorified violence and rejected democratic principles, become prime minister with the acquiescence of the king, significant portions of the elite, and even some liberals who convinced themselves that Mussolini could be moderated and controlled once in office? Part of the answer lies in the fundamental weakness of Italian democracy. Italy had only been unified in 1861, and democratic institutions had shallow roots. The franchise had only recently been expanded to include the masses, and traditional elites retained enormous influence. There was no strong tradition of democratic resistance to authoritarian encroachment. When crisis came, the reflexive response of elites was to look for a strong man to restore order rather than to defend democratic procedures. But there was also a specific calculation about fascism and Mussolini. Many conservatives believed that fascism's anti-socialism was its core feature, and that its radical rhetoric was merely tactical. They thought Mussolini could be brought into the existing system, given a stake in maintaining order, and gradually domesticated. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. Mussolini had no intention of being anyone's junior partner or of moderating his ambitions. He had built a movement based on the glorification of will, violence, and absolute leadership. Compromise and moderation were weaknesses to be exploited, not virtues to be emulated. The transformation from socialist firebrand to fascist dictator was now complete in terms of power, though the full consolidation of totalitarian dictatorship would take several more years. By 1925, following the assassination of the socialist politician Giacomo Matteotti and the subsequent political crisis, Mussolini had abandoned any pretense of operating within democratic constraints. He declared himself dictator, dissolved opposition parties, eliminated freedom of the press, and began constructing the elaborate apparatus of fascist state control that would define Italian governance until 1943. The man who had once written passionate denunciations of authoritarianism, who had called for working-class revolution against oppressive states, who had championed international solidarity over nationalist division, now commanded an authoritarian state, crushed the working-class movement through violence and repression, and promoted an extreme nationalism that defined the nation in racial and imperial terms. The reversal was total and absolute. So what are we to make of this extraordinary transformation? How do we understand the journey from socialist revolutionary to fascist dictator, from champion of the working class to architect of authoritarian nationalism? The answers to these questions have profound implications not just for understanding Mussolini as an individual, but for understanding the nature of political ideology, the fragility of democratic institutions, and the eternal vulnerability of societies to authoritarian movements. One interpretation, popular among those who want to see clear lines between left and right, is that Mussolini was always fundamentally a fascist personality who simply wore socialist clothing for a time. According to this view, his authoritarian temperament, his love of violence, his hunger for power, and his intolerance of dissent were always present. The content of his beliefs changed, but the style remained constant. He was always a would-be dictator. He simply needed to find the right ideology and historical moment to achieve his ambitions. There is truth in this interpretation. Mussolini did display authoritarian tendencies even during his socialist period. His faction within the party was always the most militant and least tolerant of compromise. His rhetoric was always aggressive and uncompromising. His personal behavior showed a consistent pattern of ruthlessness and willingness to betray allies when it served his interests. In this sense, the seeds of fascism were perhaps always present in his character. But this interpretation also risks oversimplifying a complex historical reality, because the content of ideology actually matters, not just the style. The difference between advocating for working-class revolution and advocating for nationalist authoritarianism is not merely cosmetic. These ideologies have different implications, mobilize different constituencies, and lead to fundamentally different political outcomes. To say that Mussolini was always essentially the same is to ignore the specific choices he made and the particular historical path he followed. A second interpretation focuses on opportunism. According to this view, Mussolini was never truly committed to any ideology except his own advancement. He was a socialist when socialism offered him a path to prominence. He became an interventionist when that position offered financial rewards and political opportunities. He created fascism when he recognized that there was an opening for a new kind of political movement that could exploit post-war disillusionment and elite fear of revolution. Ideology was always just a tool, cynically deployed in service of naked ambition. This interpretation also captures important truths. Mussolini was undeniably opportunistic. His willingness to accept French money to promote interventionism demonstrates a capacity for cynical calculation. His ability to synthesize elements from multiple ideological traditions into fascism suggests tactical flexibility rather than principled commitment. His career shows a consistent pattern of abandoning allies, reversing positions, and saying whatever served his interests in the moment. Yet even this interpretation leaves something unexplained. Because opportunism alone does not account for Mussolini's ability to articulate ideological positions so powerfully, to write theoretical essays that engage seriously with complex ideas, or to inspire genuine commitment from followers. If he was purely cynical, purely an actor playing roles, it is hard to explain why he was so effective at moving people and building movements. The most successful political manipulators are often those who genuinely believe their own rhetoric, at least in the moment they are speaking. A third interpretation, perhaps the most psychologically and historically sophisticated, suggests that Mussolini's transformation reveals something profound about the nature of radical political commitment itself. Extreme positions on both left and right share certain structural similarities. They both reject the existing order as fundamentally corrupt. They both emphasize will and action over compromise and process. They both claim to represent the authentic voice of the people against corrupt elites. They both glorify struggle and sacrifice. They both promise total transformation rather than incremental reform. Someone who is temperamentally drawn to extremism might move between left and right while maintaining a consistent commitment to radical transformation, violence, and absolute certainty. This interpretation helps explain how someone could move from revolutionary socialism to fascism without experiencing this as a fundamental betrayal of their core identity. Mussolini may have genuinely believed at each stage that he was pursuing the most effective path to revolutionary change. His socialism was always of a particular type, emphasizing action and will more than theory or democratic process. When he became convinced that nationalism and state power, rather than internationalism and class struggle, offered a more viable path to transformation, he made the switch without feeling that he had betrayed his essential self. The enemy was always the weak, the compromisers, the defenders of the corrupt existing order. The specific identity of who counted as enemy and who counted as ally could shift, but the basic mindset remained constant. This interpretation is disturbing because it suggests that the boundary between left and right extremism is more porous than we typically acknowledge. It implies that under certain circumstances, movements on either extreme can serve as recruiting grounds for each other because they appeal to similar psychological needs and temperamental traits, even as they advocate opposite policies. It suggests that the most important political division is not between left and right, but between those who accept the constraints of democratic pluralism and those who seek total transformation through force. The historical implications of Mussolini's transformation extend far beyond Italy. Fascism would spread to other countries, inspiring similar movements and leaders. The alliance between Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany would help make World War II possible and would lead directly to tens of millions of deaths. The ideological template that Mussolini created would be adapted and deployed in various forms throughout the 20th century and continues to influence authoritarian movements today. In a very real sense, the political reversal that began in 1914, when Mussolini abandoned socialism, helped create one of the defining horrors of modern history. For those interested in preventing the rise of future authoritarian movements, Mussolini's transformation offers crucial lessons. It demonstrates that ideological commitment can be far more shallow than it appears, that personal ambition and opportunism can masquerade as principle, and that movements that appear to be revolutionary and transformative can actually serve deeply reactionary ends. It shows how violence can become normalized and even celebrated in political life once democratic norms break down. It reveals how elites who think they can control and use extremist movements for their own purposes almost always miscalculate catastrophically. Most importantly, it demonstrates that the defense of democracy requires more than passive support. It requires active commitment, institutional strength, and the will to resist authoritarian encroachment even when such resistance seems risky or costly. The Italian king and elites who facilitated Mussolini's rise did so because they feared communist revolution more than they valued democratic procedures. They calculated that temporary authoritarian rule was preferable to the risk of radical left-wing transformation. This calculation led directly to dictatorship, war, and catastrophe. The story of Mussolini's transformation from socialist to fascist is ultimately a story about the fragility of political principles, the malleability of ideology, and the eternal human capacity for rationalization and self-deception. It is a story that deserves to be remembered not as a bizarre historical curiosity, but as a warning about how quickly and completely political systems can collapse when individuals abandon principle for power and when societies prioritize order over justice. Benito Mussolini died violently in April 1945, executed by Italian partisans and left hanging from a gas station roof in Milan, his body abused by crowds seeking revenge for years of dictatorship and war. It was an ignominious end for someone who had once commanded the devotion of millions, but perhaps it was also fitting. He had spent his career promoting violence as a political virtue and glorifying struggle as the highest form of existence. He received in the end exactly what his ideology celebrated. The socialist revolutionary, who became a fascist dictator, discovered that the violence he had championed ultimately consumed him. The question remains, could anyone have predicted this transformation when they saw that young socialist firebrand speaking to crowds in 1914? Was there something visible even then that hinted at what he would become? Or was the transformation so complete, so unexpected, that it represents something genuinely unprecedented in modern political history? The answer may be that both are true. The warning signs were there for those who knew how to read them, but the speed and totality of the reversal still shocked even careful observers. And that is perhaps the most unsettling lesson of all. The distance between revolutionary socialism and fascist dictatorship, between working-class champion and authoritarian destroyer, can be traversed in less time than it takes to fight a world war. Ideology, it turns out, is far more fluid than we typically believe, and the human capacity for reinvention, for better or worse, is nearly limitless.